going to go ahead and get started. I've had a promise of a bottle of water, so I'm going to kind of watch out for that. If you ever have sinus problems, all I can say is just get up to preach and they'll open up every time. It never fails. It always works. You know, if you're stopped up and you can't breathe, just get up to preach and your nose will decide, okay, now's the time just to let everything flow freely. I don't know why that is, but that's the way that works. But I'm going to talk this hour about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. It's a difficult topic. It's not necessarily a topic that I often speak on. I try to avoid it as much as I can because it is difficult. I'm reminded of a preaching student that was a student of Charles Spurgeon. You may know the name Charles Spurgeon, a famous British preacher. But Spurgeon had a preaching school, and folks would come to school for 4 days. But on Fridays, they would gather underneath an oak tree in Spurgeon's yard. And they would have different topics in a hat. And they would draw topics out of that hat. And then they were supposed to give an impromptu speech. Thank you. Impromptu speech on that topic. And so on this day, a young man was there, and it was his turn. And so he reached into the hat, and he pulled out a topic from that hat. And his topic was Zacchaeus. And he thought, I don't know anything about Zacchaeus. But he had to get up and he had to give at least a 5-minute talk on Zacchaeus. And so here were his 3 points. He said, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and so am I. He said, Zacchaeus was up a tree, and so am I. And he said, Zacchaeus quickly came down, and so will I. And so that's the way I feel today. When you talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, it's kind of watch the clock and, okay, how long do we have and when can we get to the end of this? Because it's one of those things that scares us a little bit to talk about it. But it's a biblical topic, and it's one that needs to be addressed. And we don't address it enough, probably because preachers don't like to preach on it. We avoid it so members don't get to hear what they need to hear concerning it. But that's a matter that definitely needs to be discussed today. Couples today are married for better or for worse, but not for long, someone has said, and that's true. Marriages today, many of them don't last very long. This year alone, there will be 1 million divorces in our country. 1 million divorces. Now, it really doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, that's only a small part of the story. Because if you have 1 million divorces, you have the lives of 2 million adults that are torn apart. And then when you begin to add children to that mix, then you may be up to as many as 4 million individuals who are being affected this year by divorce. Think about all of those people's lives that are turned upside down, that are torn apart and rearranged, and in some senses will never be the same again as a result of divorce. Now, I wish I could tell you that this was a problem that exists out in the world, and that those of us in the church, we don't have to worry about it. It's not something that bothers us. But you know that's not true, and I know that's not true, because I know members of the church, you know members of the church who have been divorced and been through this very situation. And so we know that it's a problem that afflicts us. In fact, sometimes I'm bothered by the fact that it seems to afflict as many members of the church as it does people that I know in the world. There doesn't seem to be very much difference between the marriages of those in the world and those in the church, and there should be a huge difference between the stability of marriages that are built on the foundation of God and His Word and those that don't know about God and His Word. But we see evidence of that. You remember in the first century that the Bible says that Saul made havoc of the church in Acts chapter 8 and verse 3. The devil was using Saul to tear churches apart. He was using Saul to tear apart the lives of Christians. Today, he's not using Saul, he's using other individuals, and he's using other things. We think about materialism, and we think about the materialism of our age and our world. And we think about pornography, and we think about alcohol, and we think about all these problems in our world and how that they're tearing lives apart. And we have to add divorce as one of those things that's really upsetting the lives of those that are Christians and congregations of the Lord's people. And so we want to talk about this issue. And we want to look at it from Matthew chapter 19. Of course, that's the chapter that comes to mind when we think about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We naturally think about Matthew chapter 19. We tend to think about marriage, divorce, and remarriage as a modern matter. But it isn't. It isn't at all. Do you know that this very problem was taking place in the time of Christ? In fact, marriage, divorce, and remarriage was as big of a problem in Jesus' day as it is in our day. Now, I'm not exaggerating that. I'm not just saying that for the purpose of making the sermon interesting. I mean that. It was as big of a problem in Jesus' day as it is in our day. It was as hotly debated in Jesus' day as it is hotly debated in our day. There's a lot of similarities between the environment, the setting of Matthew chapter 19 and today. We're not talking about a modern problem. We're talking about an old problem. It's modern for us, though, because we see so much of it. We see so much evidence of it in our world. W.D. Howells, an English writer, American writer really, wrote a novel entitled A Modern Instance, and it was in the late 1800s. And he was talking about divorce in that novel, and he was talking about a modern instance. And we don't think about divorce as being all that modern or something that occurred a lot in the late 1800s. If you go back to the time of Christ, it was something that occurred a lot. And when they came to Jesus and they wanted to know, can a man put away his wife for every cause? They were asking that because that's exactly what was happening. It was happening at a record level at the time of Christ. And so Jesus gets brought into the middle of one of these debates. And he's asked concerning marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And we're thankful that he was asked because we have this teaching as a result of that. There are two things that stand out to me in the early context of Matthew chapter 19. And one was the place and the other is the purpose. The place where this question was asked. And then secondly, the purpose for which this question was asked. The place where this question was asked, we're told, was beyond Jordan. Now, that may not mean a lot to you, but it will mean a lot to you when we get a little deeper in this study. The question was asked beyond Jordan. Others of the gospel writers will identify the area as Perea. And Perea is a word that means simply beyond. It was beyond Jordan. It was on the other side of the Jordan. Now, the reason why that area is interesting or important is because that was the territory of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas. Now, you may not know who Herod Antipas was, or at least not realize that you know who he was, but do you remember John the Baptizer? And you remember that John the Baptizer had some interaction with a king named Herod. And you recall that in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 4, that John the Baptizer went into this king and he condemned this king's marriage because Herod Antipas had taken his brother Philip's wife and made her his wife, or tried to at least. And so John was condemning that. And John said, it's not lawful for thee to have her. Now Herod was a politician. And Herod probably didn't like what John said, but Herod, okay, so he doesn't like me. Okay, so he doesn't like my marriage. Okay, so he doesn't agree. It just water off a duck's back as far as Herod was concerned. He may not have liked it, but it wasn't going to upset him very much. Oh, but it upset his wife. It upset Herodias. It upset her so much that when she got an opportunity to do something about it, she's going to do something about it. And Herod's going to have a birthday, and her daughter is going to come and dance before Herod. And Herod is loose-lipped, and Herod is lustful in his thoughts. And he says, I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom. And what do you think this young girl's going to ask for? If a king said to you, I'll give you anything you want up to half of my kingdom, guess what I'm asking for? I want half the kingdom, right? That's what I want. And this is the half of the kingdom that I want. I'm going to handpick the territory that's mine. That's what I'm going to ask for. That's what you're going to ask for. It's no-brainer. It's easy. That's not what she asked for. She went to her mother and asked her mother. Her mother said, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, on a charger. She goes and requests the head of John the Baptist. Herod doesn't want to do that. He's probably a little bit afraid of John, but he's going to have nightmares after this occasion, but he's going to have John beheaded because that's what Herodias wanted. So you have to understand the place. You have to understand this territory. You have to understand the purpose for which this question was being asked. They were asking this question tempting Jesus, the text tells us. These Jews were not interested in finding the truth. They didn't really want to know what Jesus had to say about marriage, divorce, or remarriage. They didn't think this illiterate carpenter had anything to teach them about marriage. But he did. And he has a lot to teach us about it. In fact, he's the creator of marriage, isn't he? He's the one that gave it to us in the beginning in Genesis chapter 2, and that's what he's going to talk about, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But you have to understand the place, and you have to understand the background, and you have to understand they were tempting Jesus. The word tempting here is a word that's used for the temptation, for example, of Satan. And it means to maliciously test someone. You're testing someone in a malicious kind of way. They're looking for something to catch Jesus on. Here's what I think they were doing. Now, I can't prove this, but if you give the area and you get the background, it makes sense. I think they were trying to get Jesus caught in the same trap that John the Baptist got caught in. John lost his head. What do they want to happen to Jesus? They want him to be put to death as well. What quicker way to get somebody put to death than to get him in trouble with the king that's in authority? This matter of marriage, divorce, and remarriage was hotly debated because of Herod and Herod's situation and because of what happened with John. You remember that John the Baptist was loved among the people. They believed that he was a prophet sent from God. And Herod killed him, and the people weren't happy about it. Here's Herod, though, and here's Herodias, and here's Salome, and here's this family. Let's get Jesus caught in the same kind of controversy John got caught in. And let's see if we can't bring about the same kind of result we got on that occasion, or happened on that occasion. Let's bring that about as well. I think that's what they're up to. I think that's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to get Jesus caught in this controversy. But Jesus, of course, is not going to get caught in the same controversy that John got caught in, but he's going to preach the same truth. He's going to answer their question with logic. He's going to answer their question with love. And we're privileged to be able to sit in on this conversation. I don't know if you ever read the Gospels this way or not, but we get to be silent witnesses to the events of the Gospels because they're recorded for us. And so when Jesus sits on the side of a well in John chapter 4 and has a conversation with a Samaritan woman, we get to be there. We get to hear this conversation. And when Jesus is talking to a young man that comes up and he says, "Good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" We get to be there to hear Jesus answer that question. We get to be present at these occasions because the Gospels record them for us. Jesus is going to answer this question. Now, you have to understand some background to appreciate what Jesus is going to say in Matthew chapter 19. This was a hotly debated matter in the first century. There were two schools of thought among the Jews. These two schools of thought, one conservative, one liberal, they came from two rabbis, highly esteemed among the Jews. One of them was named Shammah, and the other was named Hillel. Shammah was the conservative, and Hillel was the liberal. And those that followed each one of these. And it seems to me, and we'll talk about this more as we get deeper into this, that the disciples, at least at the beginning of this discussion, seem to be in the liberal camp. They seem to be in the camp of Hillel. And we'll see that by their reaction when we get to the end of the context here. Because their reaction is, well, if that's the case, then men ought not to get married. Why? Because if there's only one reason for getting divorced, then we'll just avoid marriage altogether. That's their thinking. Because the majority of people in that day, like the majority, it seems, of people in our day, like the liberal side better than they do the conservative side. But Shammah was a conservative. Shammah said that you could only get divorced for fornication, for adultery. You couldn't get divorced for just any and every cause or every reason. And the Pharisees, they would have fallen in that camp. They would have been very strict adherents to the law. But then the other side, Hillel, and Hillel died only about 20 years before Jesus is here teaching. And so he's recent to the scene. He's more liberal of the two. And Hillel said that you could get divorced for just about any reason. For example, if a wife took down her hair in public, that's cause for divorce. If a wife talks to another man, that's cause for divorce. If a wife cooks something and it isn't to your liking, that's cause for divorce. If a wife speaks ill of your family in any way, divorce her. If a wife in some way embarrasses you in public, you get rid of her. You see, there was divorce for just about every cause. Now, both Shammah and Hillel based their positions on Deuteronomy chapter 24. And they went to 24, and Shammah argued from that context, it's got to be adultery, it's got to be fornication. Hillel argued from that same context, no, you can do it for any cause. Well, the majority of people of Jesus' day would have ascribed to Hillel's position. Guess why? Why do you think men of Jesus' day would have said, I like what Hillel says? Because basically you can get out of your covenant for almost every reason. Why do you think people like the teaching of certain false teachers today and certain people today? Because you can get out of a marriage and in a marriage and out of a marriage and in a marriage and whatever as many times as you want to. All with God's approval, all with God's acceptance. And so we understand why some of those preachers and some of those positions are so popular today. And so we have to understand a little bit about that background as we get into this discussion. I love what Herschel Hobbs said about this. Herschel Hobbs said about this that we would never argue for surgery for every cause. If someone prescribed surgery for every cause, we would say, no way. No way. Surgery is a last thing you want to do. Anything to prevent surgery. That's the way I feel. If I go to the doctor says we need to do surgery, what's the first thing I'm going to say? What's the first thing you're going to say? Is there something else we can do? Is there not some medicine you can give to me? Is there not some treatment I can take? Is there not something else I can do before I have surgery? If a doctor says surgery for every cause, I'm changing doctors. I don't want that doctor. I don't prescribe to that. You wouldn't either. What about, would you ascribe to the death penalty for every crime? You go 51 in a 50-mile-an-hour speed zone? You think that deserves a death penalty? I hope not, because I've done that before. I don't want death penalty for that. I don't believe in the death penalty for every cause. Neither do you. I believe in it. I believe there's a time and a place for it, and I think we ought to exercise it more than we do. But I don't believe in it for every cause. Then we'll turn around and believe in divorce for every cause. That doesn't make sense. And I think he's right about that. But let's talk about this context and Matthew chapter 19. Read these verses together with me, if you will. Matthew chapter 19 in verses 4 through 12. And he answered and said to them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement, and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. His disciples say unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it's not good to marry. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it was given. For there are some eunuchs which were born so from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Now, as we look at this context and we divide it up, we want to see three things. We want to see, first of all, the creation of marriage. Then we want to see the legislation of Moses. And finally, the revelation of Jesus. Let's start out by talking about the creation of marriage, because that's where Jesus begins. Now, the rabbis of Jesus' day would have expected Jesus to go back to Deuteronomy 24. That's where Shammah went. That's where Hillel went. That's where their rabbis went. And so they would have expected Jesus to go to Deuteronomy 24 and pick a side. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus goes beyond Deuteronomy 24. Jesus goes all the way back to Genesis. He goes all the way back to the beginning. He goes all the way back to the institution of marriage, and that's where he's going to lay his foundation. That's where he's going to make his argument. That no doubt surprised them, because they would not have expected Jesus to go back to Genesis. But that's exactly what he did. Now, when he goes back to Genesis chapter 2, we're going to see three things. We're going to see a divine assessment, we're going to see a divine answer, and we're going to see a divine arrangement. Now, the divine assessment is this: it is not good for man to be alone. The divine answer is, I will make an helpmeet for him. That's the answer, making a helpmeet. But then we have the divine arrangement. For this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife. They twain shall be one flesh. And so we understand the context of Genesis chapter 2 in this way. Let's start out by talking about this divine assessment, where God said in Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. Now that's a divine assessment. That's God's assessment. It's not my assessment. It's not your assessment. I assume we would make the same assessment. I would at least. It's not good for man to be alone. I believe man needs companionship. But the maker of man knew that man needed companionship, and so he said it's not good for man to be alone. Now it's interesting when you lead up to Genesis chapter 2, you go through Genesis chapter 1, and God creates all kinds of things, and as God creates them, each time God says it is good. God creates light, He says it's good. God creates the sun and the moon, He says they're good. God creates the plants, God says it's good. God creates the birds and the fish, and God says it's good. God creates the beast, and God says it's good. But then God creates man before He creates woman, and there is a point on that day when God says it's not good. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about the fact that it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's not good? It's not that God made a mistake. God didn't make mistakes. He didn't then, He doesn't now. What we're doing in Genesis chapter 1, we have a panoramic view. We get to see the whole creation in one chapter. But in Genesis chapter 2, we get to see a close-up shot of creation. And we get to see primarily that sixth day, and we get to see a part of that sixth day when man has been created, but woman hasn't yet been formed. She's going to be made on the same day, but it's a certain hour within that day where God says it's not good. It goes from good to not good. By the day's end, it'll be very good. You know how it went from not good to very good? God made woman. That's what changed it. Creation without woman was not good. It would not be very good until God had finished that creation, until God had made woman. And so we see that. That's God's assessment. It's not good for man to be alone. Now that stands in the face of much religious teaching around us, where men would argue that celibacy is good. Well, God said from the beginning it's not good. God says in Hebrews 13, 4 and 5 that marriage is honorable in all. Marriage is an honorable thing. Marriage is a good thing. Does it mean you can't be single? No, it doesn't mean that. But it means, generally speaking, it's not good for man to be in that condition. Man is better served, man is happier when he has a helpmeet. And so we see this divine assessment. But then we see a divine answer, and that is, I will make an helpmeet for him. Helpmeet simply means suitable, a suitable companion for him. Someone that complements him, someone that completes him. You know, the animals all had a companion. I love this. In Genesis chapter 1, God names certain things. He names the sun, He names the moon, He names these things. But then when we get down to the animals, when we get down to those that were created on the sixth day, God doesn't name those. God lets Adam name those. I think there are two reasons for that. One is we see the intellect of man in that. Man is not some dumb caveman. No, Adam's very intelligent. Adam's able to look at animals, see certain characteristics of those animals, and give them a name. And he does so. You asked me to come up with that many names for that many animals? That's quite a job. Adam did that. But one of the things that must have been pressed upon Adam, as Adam was doing that, he saw the elephants, and he saw the deer, and he saw the kangaroos, and he saw all the things come by him. And each of them had a companion. Then the Bible says, but there was not a companion found for Adam. Adam's noticing male, female, male, female, male, female, male. No female. Adam knows something's wrong. Something's missing here. I think God was impressing Adam with the fact that something was missing. That something needed to be done. So that Adam would have the proper love for her and devotion for her, so that he would be impressed with that. And so we see the divine answer was to make someone for Adam. But then we see this divine arrangement, and that is, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife. You ever thought about in Genesis chapter 22? Who were Adam and Eve leaving? They don't have father and mother, right? They were the first man, the first woman. Why is it worded that way then? Well, when Moses writes it, Moses is writing it centuries later. Moses wrote the Pentateuch, wrote the first 5 books. He's recording it with the understanding of man leaving father and mother, cleaving into his wife. But it's already stated right here in Genesis chapter 2. Already stated on that occasion. Why? Because that's God's pattern from the beginning. Always has been God's plan. Always has been God's arrangement. A couple of things about this. First of all, it's a man and a woman. Not a man and a man, not a woman and a woman. Our world needs to hear that. Our world needs to know that. It's not Adam and Steve, it's Adam and Eve. That's the way God did it from the very beginning. Our world needs that. I don't care who likes it or doesn't like it. I'm not trying to be ugly about it, not trying to be uncaring. I'm just saying this is God's pattern from the beginning. And that's what we need to know. Notice that from the beginning, and this is the argument Jesus makes, from the beginning, it was not so. From the beginning, it was not so that a man should put away his wife for every cause. You see, they're arguing from Deuteronomy chapter 24 that a man can put away his wife from every cause. Jesus is making the point from the beginning it wasn't so. That wasn't God's desire. That wasn't God's plan from the beginning. It goes back beyond Deuteronomy 24. It goes back to Genesis chapter 2. And so that's what we're doing as well. We see the participants, man and woman. We see the permanence. And that is that they're going to cleave. They're going to be glued together. That's what that word means. And that's what Jesus is arguing from Matthew chapter 19. But now let's talk about the legislation of Moses. Let's talk about Deuteronomy chapter 24 for just a minute. We don't want to talk about it a lot because we're not under that law today, but we do want to appeal to it because that's what they appealed to. They went back to that. They're asking whether or not it's lawful for every cause in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 3. And they're going to appeal to the command of Moses. They're going to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and argue that Moses had commanded divorce. Jesus is going to make the point, as we just did, that it's not so from the beginning, Matthew 19 and verse 8. Jesus is making the point in verse 8 of Matthew 19 that God suffered it, God allowed it. But that from the beginning it wasn't God's desire. Now there were things in the Old Testament that God suffered or God allowed that were never His desire. For example, God suffered or allowed polygamy in the Old Testament, the multiplying of wives, but it never was His desire. That wasn't His pattern from the beginning, Genesis chapter 2. God allowed it, He suffered it through the Old Testament. But we see the problems that came from that reaching a great level when we get to Solomon. 700 wives and 700 wives and 300 concubines. We see that coming to the ultimate end with Solomon. But think about the king in the Old Testament. Was it God's desire for Israel to have an earthly king? No, it wasn't His desire. He was their king. But God allowed it. God suffered it. They suffered as a result of it. But it wasn't God's plan from the beginning for that to be the case. And so we see that God suffered or allowed some things under the Old Testament that never were a part of His original plan. Never were things that God wanted them to do. And so we have to understand this matter of divorce as well, that God suffered or allowed some things under the Old Testament that never were a part of His plan. Now we've got to talk about why God suffered them, why God allowed them. Or as Acts 17 says, why God winked at the times of this ignorance, why God did that. And Jesus is going to give us the reason. Jesus said, because of the hardness of what? Because of the hardness of your hearts. Jesus said, God suffered this, God allowed this because of the hardness of your hearts. And what you're going to find out from a study of Deuteronomy chapter 24 is that Moses commanded a writing of divorcement. Moses was not commanding them to divorce. God hates divorce, Malachi chapter 2. That's never changed. Never will change. That's been God's eternal attitude toward divorce. It will remain God's attitude toward it. But God commanded through Moses a writing of divorcement. There's a difference in saying that God commanded a writing of divorcement and God commanded divorce. This writing of divorcement was for the protection of the women that were being divorced. Women had very few, if any, rights under that Old Testament system. And if you read Malachi, you'll see exactly how this develops, where they were committing treachery against the wives of their youth. They were marrying these young women, keeping them for a short time, and then just dismissing them. These women had no recourse, had no outlet as a result of that. They were sent away in shame, whether or not they had done anything that was wrong, so that he could take another young woman and do the same thing again and again and again. And it was because of that hardness of their hearts that God allowed the writing of divorcement. Now, here's what the writing of divorcement would do. The writing of divorcement, number one, would allow a cooling down period. It would take some time to get this writing of divorcement, which would mean that the divorce would not be over in just one big blow-up fight. But it would take some time in order for that to happen. It would allow both parties to cool down a little bit and maybe rethink this. Another thing that it would do is that it would state the reason why this was occurring. It would put that reason in writing so that the man could not later on claim a different reason for why he put the wife away. It would make him put in writing exactly what the reason was. That was for her protection. If she had not committed adultery, not been guilty of that, then whatever reason he put down would help her in the situation of being able to form a marriage or have a marriage with someone else. It was for her protection. So those were things that God allowed to be done for the protection of these women that otherwise they would have been punished even more severely. But it never was the case that God changed his attitude toward divorce. And I want you to understand that. It also would prevent this man from ever being able to come back and take this woman to be his wife again. Once he did this, once he divorced her, he could never have her back again. Even if she got married and the next husband died and he decided at that point, I'll take her back, he was not allowed to. It made it very permanent. And it prevented him from being able to change his mind and then rechange his mind, go back and forth on these situations and make women pawns of his desires. It kept that from happening. And so Jesus is talking about that. He's referring back to the legislation of Moses. Now, why that's important is this. Who did they consider themselves to be disciples of? They would say to Jesus on one occasion, well, we're Moses' disciples. We're not your disciples, we're Moses' disciples. So they put a lot of stock in Moses, put a lot of stock in what Moses said. But if you read the other gospel accounts of this, Jesus is going to ask them, what did Moses command? Because what they thought Moses commanded and what Moses actually commanded were very different things. That's often the case. What Hillel was arguing that Moses was allowing, Moses never allowed. Never was the intention of Deuteronomy chapter 24. If your wife talked to another man, you get rid of her. If she burned the bread, you get rid of her. If she spoke ill of your family, that never was the intention. And Jesus said, what did Moses command? He's asking them to consider that. But then we get to the revelation of Jesus, and that's where we want to spend the rest of our time, because this is the matter that really gets down to where we are today and where we live today, because we don't live under the law of Moses today. And so whatever the legislation of Deuteronomy 24 would have allowed, it doesn't allow that today. We're not under that law. It's been nailed to the cross. So we're under a new law today. And we know that at times in the past, God did allow some things that he doesn't allow today. Under the Old Testament period, you read through the Psalms, you have reference to mechanical instruments of music. David employed those. Some would argue with God's approval, some would argue without God's approval. But we clearly see in the Psalms where David's commanding those things. David was not struck dead for introducing them. Others that corrupted the worship were struck dead. Nadab and Abihu, Leviticus 10, 1 and 2, and other places. And so I reached the conclusion that they were allowed in the Old Testament. But even if you could make the point that God allowed instrumental music under the Old Testament, it would not in any way allow you to do that today. Because God's law today will not allow it. God says today that the instrument is the heart. We pluck the strings of the heart. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. So just because something was allowed under an Old Testament system doesn't mean it's allowed today. There were other things that were allowed then that would not be allowed today. And so we've got to talk about the revelation of Jesus and what Jesus has to say about things. Now, as we look at this, we want to see three things. We want to see the reach, that is, whosoever. We want to see the reason, and that is for fornication. And we want to see the reaction. That's the way the disciples reacted to what Jesus had to say. Now, notice the reach. Jesus said, whosoever shall put away his wife. Why that word is so important is because of the reach of that word. Whosoever would mean Jew and Gentile. Whosoever would mean male and female. Whosoever has a great reach to it. It gives the scope. Now, the reason why that's so important is because sometimes people will argue today that those in the world are not amenable to the law of Christ. In other words, the law of Christ doesn't apply to them. God's marriage law doesn't apply to those in the world. That's the argument. And so if these individuals ever decide to be baptized, to come into the church, then whatever they did while they were in the world, whatever marriages they formed, whatever they did out there, that doesn't matter because they weren't amenable. They weren't under God's law at that time. Now, Jesus says whosoever. Jesus is making clear this applies to Jew and Gentile. This applies to believer and unbeliever. This applies to male. This applies to female. This applies to everyone. Everyone must submit to the law of Christ. Colossians 3 and verse 16 says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatsoever you do, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord." Now, when we think about that, whatever you do all in the name of the Lord. That applies to everyone. Everyone must submit to the law of Christ. Christ is the King of kings. He's the Lord of lords. Everyone must submit to Him. And so this word whosoever would include everyone. All men are amenable to the law of Christ. God only has one plan, and that plan is for the whole world. Matthew 28:18 through 20. But let's talk about the reason for this. They ask, shall a man put away his wife for every cause, in verse 3. Here's Jesus' answer in verse 9. Jesus says, for one cause. They say for every cause. Jesus says for one cause. They believed that a man could put away his wife for whatever reason he wanted to. Jesus said, oh no, the reason has to be this. It has to be for fornication. That's the one reason that Jesus gives. Jesus narrows it down. And we see, individuals today will argue, well, God's marriage law is not very restrictive. Oh, yes, it is. And just look at the reaction of the disciples, which we'll talk about in just a minute. How did they see the marriage law of Jesus? Did they not see it as very restrictive? So much so, they said it's better not to get married. If there's only one reason why you could ever get out of this, then why in the world would you ever get into it? They're thinking that's far too restrictive. The teaching of Jesus was often seen as very restrictive. You remember the rich young ruler? How he went away sorrowful for he had great possessions. Why? Because the teaching of Jesus required a lot. It required a lot of that man. Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor and come follow me. He wasn't willing to do that. And there are many that Jesus says here will not be willing to do this. But Jesus makes very clear there's just one reason, and that is fornication. And that's the fornication of one's mate. That is one's mate committing fornication. If you do not commit a fornication, then you have the right to put them away and then to remarry. But it's very restrictive. And the disciples understood that it was very restrictive. If two people divorce for any other reason than fornication to marry another, then they are committing adultery. Jesus made that very clear. Now, God allows the innocent to remarry, but God does not allow the guilty to ever be able to remarry. They're bound by this divorce. They're bound and not able to remarry. Now, I want you to mention a couple of things, a couple of words. First of all, the word fornication. Jesus said for fornication. The word for fornication is the Greek word porneia. It's a general word. It's a generic word, as we sometimes say. It's a word that contains any number of kinds of sexual immorality. But then the word becomes more specific when we get to the word adultery. When we talk about makia, that's a more specific word. And it refers to sexual intercourse on the part of a person who's married with someone who isn't their mate. And so the Bible uses both of these words. And committed adultery is used in the tense of continues to commit adultery. It's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing action as they do this. Now, when we think about why Jesus used the word porneia, of other words he could have used, is because he condemns so many things. And because he condemns homosexuality as well as sexual sin between men and women. It involves sexual sin that would involve women, or sexual sin that would involve men with men. And so that's the reason why Jesus used the word fornication, because he's so specific. In Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8, we understand the seriousness of adultery, and that is that it will keep one from being able to go to heaven. It is a characteristic of those who will miss heaven. Now notice the reaction of the disciples. The reaction of the disciples is very interesting, because they consider this a hard saying. John chapter 6 and verse 60, sometimes Jesus would say things, and they would say to Jesus, Jesus, that's a hard saying. That's hard to accept. Sometimes as preachers, Troy can tell you this, sometimes as preachers we preach a sermon, and we'll come out, and somebody will come out and they'll say, that was a hard lesson. That was a hard sermon. You stepped all over my toes today. That's going to be hard for me to do. Well, that's the nature of truth. Sometimes truth is hard. And Jesus talked about how hard this was. And he talked about how that some would have difficulty receiving it. Now, he talks about three groups of eunuchs. He talks about those that were born eunuchs. He talks about those that were made eunuchs. And he talks about those that are eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Those that are born eunuchs, in other words, they're born in such a way that this is never an issue for them. Then there are those that were made eunuchs. Anytime someone was in, for example, in care of a queen, they were made eunuchs to protect the queen and to prevent any confusion regarding those children, who was the father of those children. And so those that were made eunuchs. And then we have those that were eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. That is, those who choose to remain by themselves because they want to go to heaven, and because of the kingdom of heaven, and because of the sake of the kingdom of heaven. You think about Paul, and you think about Paul's choice not to marry. You think about all the things that Paul went through. You think about all the persecutions, all the times he was stoned, all the times he was beaten, he was left for dead, all the different things. You just imagine if Paul was married. Paul knew the dangers that he was facing. He knew exactly what he was walking into. Can you imagine a wife being at home, not knowing from day to day whether Paul's finally been put to death? So Paul chose, for the sake of the work that he was doing for God, not to engage in what the rest of us have engaged in, or most of us have engaged in, and that's marriage. But then you have those who will choose not to ever be married again because of the kingdom of heaven's sake, because they want to go to heaven. You have some who were the guilty party in a marriage. And as a result of that, they're not allowed to remarry. If they want to go to heaven, they have to stay single. That's not easy. And it's certainly not easy for them. They have the same desires that we have, but they can't act on those desires. They have been married. They know what it's like to have the privileges and blessings of marriage, but they know they can't have those again. And they've already demonstrated, at least in that case, if they were the guilty party, they've already demonstrated that they have a weakness in this area. And so now they're going to have to remain the rest of their lives without doing this, even though they've already proven they have difficulty with that in the past. So we think about how hard that is. And that's one of the hardest things, and Troy will tell you as well, that's one of the hardest things, that when we sit down and we have a Bible study with someone, and we ask questions, and we find out that they've been married before, and we have to start asking questions about that marriage and why they got divorced and what was the reason for that. And that's hard. It's really hard. Because you see people who at this point in their lives are studying the truth and wanting to obey the truth, and yet for some of them, in order for them to obey the truth, in order for them to do what God would have them to do, for them to be able to go to heaven, they've got to live by themselves the rest of their lives. And that's hard to tell a man that's 30. He's going to have to live by himself the rest of his life if he wants to go to heaven. Or to tell a young lady that she's going to have to remain single if she wants to go to heaven because she didn't have a right to get divorced and she doesn't have a right to marry anyone again. That's hard. But we've got to love people enough to tell them the truth. You know, we don't serve them or help them by telling them a lie. Oh, we make them feel better for the moment. We make it easy for ourselves for the moment. But one day they're going to stand before God on the day of judgment. They're going to have to answer for the needs of their lives. I'm not doing them a favor if I don't prepare them for that day. It's just like a teacher in school. You can let the students come in and do what they want to every day in class, but what happens when you give them that test and they're not ready for it? The teacher that truly loves those students and wants to help those students is the teacher that's giving those students what they need every day, even though they don't like it sometimes, teaching them even what they don't like to hear because they know the test is coming and they want them to be ready, prepared for that test, and ultimately prepared for life. And we're trying to prepare people for heaven, something far more important. We've got to give them the right answer. We've got to give them the answer that God gives from His Word. That's a serious thing. That's a hard thing sometimes to do. Somebody says, well, why don't you just baptize them? Why don't you just baptize them anyway? Well, it wouldn't do them any good. In fact, it would do them a lot of harm because it would give them a false hope. It would give them a hope of something they don't really have a hope of. You see, in order to be a candidate to be baptized for the remission of your sins, you have to repent of your sins. You can't stay in that relationship and be baptized, and that baptism take away your sin. And the reason why it won't take away your sin is because
you've got to repent before those sins can be taken away. What is repentance involved? A change of the mind. Brought about by godly sorrow, which results in a reformation of life. You can't keep living the way you've been living. You've got to change your living. You want to be right with God. Any questions about this? Any things that come to mind? I've already heard the bell ring, but and I've been watching the clock a little bit, so I know it's about time. But I know this is a serious matter, and we certainly can't cover everything that needs to be covered, but we need to read and study Matthew chapter 19 and make sure we're living by God's law. Because ultimately, Jesus said, "He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judges him." In John 12 and verse 48, this is what will be used. We want to make sure we're in accordance with it. Thank you for your attention this morning.